I didn't turn your mic on. I'm sorry. So it's just a green light. Just move it to that. Yeah. So Paul came in last night, regrettably late because he flew through O'Hare. Did any of you read? If you get the New York Times, did you read about the way they rated, or maybe it was in the Arizona Republic today? Was it? Okay. Rated airports. So we actually made the top list, but O'Hare, O'Hare did not make a particularly high rating, and Paul flew through O'Hare, so he got in late. But we had time to go out to brunch this morning, and I drove him around because he hasn't really had a chance to see some of the pretty parts of Phoenix. When you fly in, it looks sort of like all brown, right? Right. It does, right. So we went out to Jordy's at the Biltmore Mansion, which has a beautiful view. Um, and so here we are. But we didn't drink, did we? That was probably a mistake. I'm still hungover from last night, and I'm not actually a drinker. Anyway, we are here. We are here to talk about the 15th book in the Mike Bowden investigative. He's an investigative game warden, which is that unique to Maine, the investigative part, Paul?
Chuck Box tells me that they don't have them in Wyoming.
Ah.
So that gives me a little bit of latitude to differentiate myself from Joe Pickett. I can I can do some different things with Mike Bowditch that Joe can't do. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how many states have the warden investigator position.
I don't either. I know. I'm sorry. I'm turning off my phone. I forgot. I do know because I myself was once arrested for speeding in Smoky Mountain National Park. That there are some law enforcement things that rangers can do, but maybe it's only national park rangers. I really don't know.
Well, in Maine, game wardens, they attend the Criminal Justice Academy, and then they have their special training after that. But they are fully sworn officers of the law. And for a while, they were advertising themselves as basically Maine's rural police force or Offwood's police department. And if you know anything about Maine, you realize all of Maine is is off-road, you know. So yeah, it was. It gives me again a lot to do because a game warden can arrest you for speeding, and in theory can arrest you for murder. Although those cases quickly get handed off to the state police.
So in your last book, which I truly love, the one that takes place on and in the lake, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, you had I think at least three different law agencies that were. It was a really complicated case.
Yeah. So with every book that I write, I like to play with the genre a bit. And Dead Man's Wake, which is the one that came out in hardcover last June and now is out in paperback, is my stab at a police procedural. And so I really wanted to illustrate, what would happen, how would these various departments work together, what would they do, and my editor found it terrifically confusing. And I'm like, well, but this is reality. This is, it does.
This is more about your editor than it does about it.
I don't want to say anything.
Really wasn't
I love my
confusing.
editor. No. But it was fun playing with that, whereas Pitch Dark is more of a suspense novel, I would say.
It is a suspense novel, and it's not. It's easy to think of it as what we call a chase novel, which is Mike going after, potential bad guy anyway. But it turns out it's not really like that, is it? The structure of this novel is more looping. Want to tell us why you decided to write it that way?
So yeah, it started with thinking about my novel Dead by Dawn, which was a book that was really special for me. It won some awards. It sold really well, but that's not why I wanted to go back to it. In that book, Mike is the hunted. It's the longest night of his life. He's being chased along a frozen river through the snowy woods, etc. And I really liked writing a book that had that kind of energy and propulsion going on. And I sort of started from the standpoint of, well, it's been a few books, and maybe the time has come. Mike keeps maturing in some ways from book to book. So maybe the time has come for him to be the chaser, the hunter. and what could I do with that? The thing that I knew pretty quickly was that I didn't want it to just be a straight, here's the bad guy's fleeing, and Mike is going after him. I wanted it to have lots of twists and turns to it too, because that was something that I have not played with for the most part. I mean, I've not written my, Gillian Flynn book, So this is probably as close as I will ever get to having those kinds of reversals and that sort of thing. People that you think are good turn out to be bad. Things that happen that seem bad turn out to be good. And Mike is kind of off balance through the entire night, because once again, it does take place in the course of a single night.
So this is Mike, I mean, not to mince words about it, this is Mike being as bullheaded as Mike can ever be. Really swinging into action against common sense and, realism. But that's Mike. But in this book, I thought, and maybe he has to be that way for the structure of this book, that if he weren't so pig-headed, my father loved pig-headed. That was fun. He used to call me that a lot. If he weren't so pig-headed, he wouldn't keep going. And so I guess it's a necessary part of it. There were a couple of times when I just wanted to slap him and say, come on.
Oh, that's been the way it's gone from the beginning.
And yet Paul is so nice. Right, it's probably your inner Paul coming out in Mike, whatever it is.
That's a conversation with my wife. I think people should.
So my local, not in loco parentis, but right. Anyway, in those of you who are Mike Bowditch fans, which I'm assuming most of you are, know that he has a pretty complicated history. His father was a criminal, and was murdered, if I remember. Died anyway. I can't remember. He was murdered, wasn't he?
We'll leave it vague.
Somewhere. Anyway, Mike did not have, obviously, great parenting or an easy childhood. And just by Charlie Stevens, who has a big role in this book, who turns out, finally, he's gotten married. He and, not Charlie, but Mike and Stacy have finally gotten married. That's at the very beginning.
Yes.
So not a spoiler.
Sorry for those of you who are rooting for Mike to go in a different direction.
Anyway, Charlie has been in local parentis for Mike for a long time. And he's a really wonderful character. I thought a book or two back we were in danger of your having killed him off. I hope I'm glad that you rethought that.
Yeah, I have a little private list which I keep about characters that I cannot kill off. And one of them will be Charlie Stevens, who's going to live to be 140 years old. And then the other one is Mike's wolf dog, which I think if I were to ever kill that animal off, somebody would come stalking me. So that will be the oldest living canine in recorded history. I guarantee you, he will outlast me.
I have to tell you, last night somebody brought a military service dog to Jack's event. It was a really big dog, really black dog. And the thing I loved about it, although I'm sorry for the dog, was that he had an eye injury or some kind of thing. And so he is wearing these incredible black sunglasses, the dog. And he looks like the Man in Black. I mean, it's just so cool. I tried to get a really good photo of him, but I only got kind of a sideways thing. But when he turned and looked at you, it was like he was a motorcycle riding, with this big black thing and all. He was the best dog. I mean, he behaved super well throughout the entire evening. But I thought of your big dog, who's still mostly living outside.
Yeah, he's going to be gradually domesticated over the course of the coming novels.
Can you really do that with a part wolf?
Well, yeah, because he started out as a wolf dog. He was, raised in essentially kind of a wolf dog puppy mill in Montana, and spent his earliest years, as a domestic animal. And I'm hoping that, the reality is that with fiction, you just have to make things plausible, right? It has to just feel convincing enough that you can get away with it. So we'll see. But no, he's never going to be driving on patrol with Mike or anything like that. That would
never out there in a cap and sunglasses.
No sunglasses. But you actually, Barbara, you said something interesting before about Mike being so stubborn. It was funny. I was on Zoom call with a producer, a Hollywood producer, the other day, and I said the thing about Mike Bowditch is that his best quality is his worst quality, in the sense that he is somebody who he's very stubborn. He sort of leaps before he looks. And I used the analogy because it refers somewhat to my book, The Bone Orchard, where a car drives into a flooded quarry with young women in it, and the other first responders are all getting there, and they're looking down and looking at the car, in as it's kind of going into the water, and they're all like, "What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this?" And Mike just takes his boots off and jumps, and that's where he's being the hero. In this book, in Pitch Dark, he has some moments where he takes things a little bit too far, where it's just going to mean more trouble for him, or or as Barbara said, you're going to shake your head and say, "Why are you doing that?" It's like, because that's just how he is. That's his character, is to just is to keep going.
But he has to be a pretty impressive physical specimen, as long as having, if you're not, you just don't jump into the river and expect to make it back. So part of his stubbornness, I think, is that he is, an imposing guy and in good shape.
Yeah, well, one of the things that actually really motivated me over the course of the series, but it was especially true with Dead by Dawn, which was a survival story. I'd been reading I'd been reading both fictional survival stories and real life survival stories. And one of the and I read I won't name the fictional survival story, but it just rubbed me the wrong way. And I said, I want to do one, but I want to do it better. The thing about, if you read history, especially if you read like frontier history, the stories or war histories, combat, etc., what the individual human is able to do under duress. I mean, we live in a kind of a coddled society. We can't imagine this, but people know the movie The Revenant, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, right? It's based on a book which is based on a real story. And it's like you're saying, okay, the story basically starts with the guy getting attacked by a bear. His friends decide he's basically dead, so they bury him alive, and he has to claw his way out from the ground and then travel hundreds of miles. I mean, this really happened, and there are stories like this all through historical books and things. And I think it's funny now that a lot of times, I'll get mail from people just shaking their head and saying, well, that could never happen. Mike couldn't survive this, Mike couldn't survive that. And I'm like, there was a guy at the Chosin Reservoir who had both legs blown off and still, or whatever, killed 20 people attacking him. I mean, it was just like, there are these things that humans are capable of. That
adrenaline is a really powerful thing.
And strength of will.
It came up last week. We had sort of a conversation like this, and I reminded people of the guy here. Remember, he got his arm caught in a cleft in a rock, and he couldn't get away, and there he was, and he could have just given up and died, and instead he cut off his arm. And not everybody is capable of doing that, but his urge to survive was so great that he basically did an amputation without anesthetic on himself. So it's hard to. Was
it
that
was
what
a Swiss
it was?
Army knife,
Yeah. So it's certainly true that different people have a different capacity for doing that. So Stacy is another character that has been in and out of the series, and for a while she was out of the series. And I've always really loved the opening scene in the book where we're in Florida. And there's is it a python or is it a boa?
Yeah, so
It's a python, isn't it?
the one time that I've set part of a book in another state was the beginning of my novel, One Last Lie. Charlie Stevens' daughter, Stacy Stevens, Mike's on again, off again love interest, has left the state. She was fired from the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife in Maine and has gotten a job in the Everglades working for a nonprofit to protect the Florida panther, which is in decline. One of the things that's going on in the Everglades is that it turns out that habitat is perfect for Burmese pythons. And so they're not entirely sure how the pythons, there's like lots of urban legends about how the pythons got there, but the pythons are just spreading through the Everglades and eating everything.
Yeah, no, they have bounties on them, and
Yeah.
they have hunting contests. You can, for every python you kill, you get
Yeah.
rewards, the whole bit. But anyway, there's a horrible scene was Dave. That was really one of the worst scenes, scariest, not worst, that you've ever written.
Well, so I've spent some time in the Everglades, and I said I have to find some way to work this into a book sooner or later. So I put Stacy in the Everglades for the express purpose of having a scene with a Burmese python somewhere down the road, and it was actually a lot of fun to write that one, just because.
Only an author would say that.
Well, the animals in Maine are not particularly dangerous, fortunately. So we don't have I can't put Mike up against a grizzly bear or a mountain lion or whatever. So
Are there any black bears in Maine?
there are black bears. We have I think only 2 recorded fatalities over the course of centuries. But, those are dangerous animals, I mean, under certain circumstances.
Any of you seen the video, and I think it's on Instagram, of the pizza stealing black bear up towards Prescott? It's wonderful. You know how people have doorbell cameras? So apparently this family ordered pizza, and, guy came and delivered the pizza, and the family then, heard the doorbell ring, and so they opened the door, and the pizza was gone. What happened? So they did it again another night, and this time they had their doorbell camera paid. Anyway, this bear trundles out of the woods right behind the pizza guy, snatches the pizza, off he goes. And no interaction with the humans. It wasn't dangerous for the people. Maybe the pizza driver could have been mugged, but I just love that. But I wondered if that was kind of like learned behavior, for the bear. Why would he have taken up pizza?
Yeah, I mean, animals are really smart and can be, I mean, not all of them, but of course, but bears certainly are. And, they get habituated to certain recurring things that people do, which is why we don't tend to, in national parks, just put our trash everywhere, because, Yogi Bear.
Out to focus on the buffalo,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
honestly.
So-
Right. Well, that brings me to the biggest character in all of your books, aside from the people. It's really Maine. It's really landscape of Maine, the wilderness of Maine. And in this book, if as much as any book I have read, and there's several authors who write really well about Maine, Michael Carita, Tess Gerritsen, Jerry Boyle, whatever, this book makes it clear that Maine is a border state and how porous the border is, because you really can't patrol an arbitrary line that isn't visible, that wanders through mountains and whatever. So this is a big thing in this book for Mike, is Canada.
Yeah, that was actually one of the big motivations too in writing this book, was spending time in Arizona, and of course so much attention within your state, but nationally, is on our southern border. And it's a bit of a culture shock for me to drive around and have to go through a checkpoint or whatever, because I also live in a border state. And it is true that we tend to see U.S. Customs and Border, whatever it's called these days, vehicles more than we used to in odd places. But the main border with New Brunswick, Canada, and Quebec, Canada, is it's largely, it's unfenced. Mostly it consists of something called the slash, which is a 20 yard wide cut through the forest, and you can literally just hop back and forth along that border. Now, they do have the Border Patrol on both sides has ways of monitoring. They use sensors and things just like they do down here, but the urgency is much less. Let's put it that way. Another thing I wanted to mention is that all border patrols, as far as I know, this could be changing too, is that the border patrol officers in Maine have all trained on your border, which I'm not sure does them a lot of good when they're dealing with this French-speaking grandmother who's trying to get her hair cut in the United States and just wants to cross the bridge, So there's a bit, again, I've heard from the agents that they have to learn to be a little bit, just more relaxed. And, I mean, it's not to say that things can happen and you need to be on alert, obviously. But so there's been so much written, of course, about our southern border. And I said, I want to write about our northern border. And furthermore, I mean, Mike is always somebody who stretches boundaries and reaches a border, and what happens. In this book, Mike literally reaches the border of another country, and does he keep going or not is the question, even though that's in violation of basically every rule you can possibly imagine. And you have to look at, the scenario when it happens and say, well, what would I do? And then, of course, he's not going to do what you would do because you're sane.
Well, there will be consequences. Well, anyway, why don't you set up the story for us now that we've talked about all these various elements?
So in this book, Mike he's a warden investigator, which means he's basically a plainclothes detective that the warden service employs. He investigates boating crashes, hunting homicides, which are when somebody gets shot while hunting, snowmobile fatalities, ATV fatalities, those sorts of things. He also gets involved in searches. And in any kind of case that is taking place in the North Woods that's a little unusual, bigger feeling. So this book starts with Mike getting a phone call from a young game warden, sort of a baby Mike, saying, I think we might have this missing person. And as Mike is, it's a time of the year, which is early May, where everything is mud. The forest is basically impassable. Nobody is coming to the North Woods to go recreating. And this guy has come to the North Woods and he's rented an ATV, and he's looking for a father and daughter, and who he thinks is living somewhere hidden in the woods. And he sounds like a really scary dude. And as it turns out, as Mike does some prying, he finds out there is a father and daughter living in the woods. They're building a cabin for somebody he kind of knows. But the father and daughter also seem kind of shady. And so, but at least he can get in touch with them. And so he arranges to be sort of flown in to this cabin that they're building for someone he knows. It's right on the Canadian border. It's in the middle of nowhere. He goes with his friend Charlie Stevens. They arrive. They start talking to the father and the daughter. And immediately things begin to go topsy-turvy on the whole situation. And, as I say, I don't want to give away too much because there's just, I really did try to put in place a lot of different reversals where you think what's going to happen, and it's not what happens. But it does lead to a chase. And it was really, it also, there are very, boy, I feel like I'm saying these things about my editor, whom I love, as I say, but he always says, too many characters, Paul. You need fewer characters in this book. So in this book, I think I got it down to about 12 people. It's very small in terms of the cast of characters, which again was sort of fun in a way, because it allowed me to write a very streamlined story, I think.
One of the characters, anyway, at least one, actually more, are Canadian. So we're not just dealing with Mainers here. But let's go back and talk about the baby game warden, because he has potential. Because he is sort of like a baby Mike, He's somebody that you could conceivably do more things with as he comes along. What is it that Mike finds both annoying and compelling about him?
That's a great question, because somebody was I was doing an event, and somebody was I made a comment about how I view the series, which is this. Usually when you read a mystery series, you know, the main character at least stays fairly the same, right? He or she is consistent from book to book. You're not really charting the evolution of this person's personality. I mean, that's not universally true, obviously, but with Mike, in The Poacher's Son, he's 24 years old, and he's a very young 24 years old. He's now 33, so I'm getting older a lot faster than he is. But I've been trying to chart his development, you know, his personal and professional development over the course of the books. And so in some ways, I feel it's less of a series and more of a saga, if that makes sense. You know, again, the publishing team works really hard so that you can pick up any book and not feel lost. But I think it benefits from sort of following Mike from the beginning. And somebody said to me, you know, well, okay, that's really, you know, that's really compelling. I'd said something like, yeah, there are times where I feel like I'm writing Mike Bowditch's autobiography. And he said, well, what would come next in his life? You know, what's he going to have to tackle soon? And, you know, he's now getting into be middle-aged and
Wait a minute.
well, he's young middle age. And it was like, well, he's going to have to have his own mic. You know, he's going to be in a position finally where he's going to have to mentor someone else.
Right. So it's sort of mirroring Charlie and Mike. Charlie has mentored Mike, and now Mike's turn to turn around and mentor somebody else. Right. So what is it about this kid that rubs Mike wrong?
I think it's a combination of things. Primarily, it's a kind of arrogance that Mike possesses himself, right? We're always most bothered by people who have our faults. It's like, you know, it's like, he's also telling Mike, no, we can't do it this way. It's not allowed. So again, that's also getting under Mike's skin because he's never been held back by that, even though he understands that's been a problem in his life, that he has consistently sort of flouted rules and norms and that sort of thing. And so you have this sort of young guy who's coming in and he's also this guy is a young father, and it's almost like Mike is seeing aspects of himself, but also maybe a better version of the game warden he could have been when he was 25 or 26, and that's particularly aggravating for him.
So basically what this young man is worried about is not the father and daughter. He's worried about some guy that is looking for the father and daughter but has disappeared, just to make that clear, because and that eventually leads Mike to. So in a way, this is a chase novel. It's also a rescue novel, right?
Yeah, it is. The whole premise is that under normal circumstances, somebody disappears in the Maine woods. The warden service makes a fairly quick determination whether they're going to start looking for this person or not. And where are they going to start? There's a term that's used. It's becoming pretty well known, which is like the point last seen, and that's where we can prove that this person was and try to identify who saw this person last, etc. What did they say they were going to do? It's and so normally that's the sort of thing where they just begin to go and search, but it's Mike's, his spider sense is kind of going off that there's something else happening in this particular instance, because this man who has disappeared doesn't belong there. He seems very odd. He's 6'6" and covered with tattoos, and every time he bends over you can see he has a revolver tucked in his belt. and he's offering $100 bills to people for information about this father and daughter, and it's like, this guy sounds like really bad news, you know.
Plus, it's too early for for tourists or
Yeah.
as you say, recreation people to be there. It would maybe in June. It wouldn't
Right.
set off so many alarms. But it's a late
Yeah.
spring in this Maine too, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. That. So I chose again. One of the things about each book is I try to choose. I go into it knowing what part of the state I want to write about and the time of year. And so I deliberately set this book in really the most miserable time to be in the woods of Maine, because it's not frozen and it's not solid either. Nothing is
March in Chicago.
Yeah,
where I
nothing
grew
has
up,
been
yeah.
cleaned up. All the trees that fell down during the winter are are blocking the roads. And so, again, it was just like, this is a chase novel in which everything is blocked. He's going to have, instead of going this way, he has to go that way. And it was just trying to put as many obstacles in his way that I could.
Back to my point about the wilderness being an active flare
Mm.
and all this. So say a few words about Josie, because she might possibly be more
Sure.
difficult than Mike.
Yeah, so the person who's hired this father and daughter is a friend of Charlie. She's a bush pilot, and she flies float planes, but she also flies helicopters, and has worked with not just the Warden Service, but with the Border Patrol. She's worked with the Canada Border Service Agency on searches and this sort of thing, and she lives in this town called Jackman. Jackman is sort of the last town on the road before you get to Quebec, and it very much embraces its identity as sort of a frontier town. Whenever I do write a book, I spend a lot of time in wherever it is that I'm writing about, because I'm trying not just to sort of like make sure that I get the trees right and those sorts of things, but I also try to like pick up aspects of the culture. And as I say early on in this book, so it's not much of a spoiler, Jackman has two like town mottos. The first one is for tourists. So Jackman is very mountainous by Maine standards and has beautiful lakes. So it advertises itself as the Switzerland of Maine, which is a bit superlative, to say the least. It's an impressive place, but it's not the Alps. But there's another slogan that you see when you're up there. You go to the general store, you're hanging out, getting a cup of coffee, and you see mugs that people are drinking from, and you see bumper stickers. And the other slogan is Jackman, more mountains, less assholes. And I think between those two, you get a sense of this place, And so it was really, again, it's each time I write a book, I want to set it in a part of Maine that it's not just different from someplace I've written about before, but it represents an aspect of the state that I haven't visited yet, And Jackman really does, embody the idea of the border town, the frontier town.
So, as any self-respecting reader with a phone, I went to Maine and opened up maps and actually looked for Jackman. And I think it helps with this book if you actually take a look at Jackman and you can trace the border kind of, and think it makes it clearer what's going on. I never used to do that, but they used to put maps in books.
I
You
love
don't
maps
see
in
maps
books.
anymore, so you've got your own map. But I find myself, like when I'm reading thrillers, like from Mark Grady on Tuesday night and all, he's in West Africa, and he's in Lagos, but he has to be somewhere else. And I think my African geography is shaky, I would say. So, I found it really helped. I, opened up my phone and got the map thing out, and then I could kind of see what it was all about. And I think it helps ground you in a story.
If I
you're
could,
not
I would
familiar
put a
with
map
the
in
area.
everyone.
Yeah, as a reader, I think if you can visualize it, that it makes it more realistic. So while we were having brunch, Paul and I were talking about the crime novel as, well, you remember the conversation. Tell them what we were talking about, because that was really interesting.
Well, we were talking about, there used to be this tradition in American literature, actually international literature, of something called the social novel, right? Upland Sinclair wrote about the horrible conditions in the stockyards, about yellow journalism, sort of the muckraking. Theodore Dreiser wrote about the gap between the very poor and the very wealthy and that sort of thing. And those, it was the idea that the great literature grappled with the big issues of the day. And it still happens. I mean, people still write those books. But I think one of the things that's kind of gets lost sometimes when people talk about mysteries, crime novels, detective stories, whatever you want to call them, is that a lot of those concerns have kind of migrated into detective fiction. That if you want to, really learn about, say, the impact of the drug epidemic, right? You're probably more likely to get a better picture of it, in a thriller that deals with the cartel, I mean, you can make a case. I mean, probably one of the greatest television shows ever was The Wire. And The Wire was a police procedural. It was a mystery novel, essentially made for television. But it was grappling with all of these different things about the impact of drugs, about the impact of drugs on the black communities of Baltimore, on the corruption of the city, power structure, etc. And I think that if you are an enthusiastic reader of crime novels, which I'm suspecting describes the people here, you've probably learned a lot about these sorts of issues that we're talking about, just reading page turners, because this is the stuff that police are on the front lines of so many of the crises that we're going through as a culture.
And thrillers are often, chasing geopolitical fault lines.
True.
But, part of the reason is that these kinds of books depend on conflict. Nothing, if everything's just okay, there's no real work for the investigator or the Army Ranger or whatever it might be to do. And also, most of the time, we want it to come to resolution. We want to follow through something that will eventually take us to a different, better place, as in this book. Although I have to say, this book is really going to surprise you when you get to the end. And you're going to think about it for quite a while. I certainly have. Very sneaky.
Thank you.
You're
I'll take that
welcome.
as a compliment.
Right. It was a compliment. But I do think that those are, one of the reasons to read crime fiction is, A, you get to learn stuff because authors have to learn stuff in order to do a good job. And B, you do get to address, as you point out, a lot of societal issues, social issues, in a painless way. It's not like reading the New York Times or something. And generally, it's not preaching at you, it's part of the story. So anyway, the waiter looked at us somewhat askance while we were having this conversation. It's like, why are you here for brunch? I know. I loved it. So how about questions for Paul? I would like to ask questions.
So, Sue Grafton wrote Kinsey, like she never got older, she never got computers, I can't quite decide how you do. Are you going along as?
So Mike, I should say from the very beginning, lives in kind of an alternate universe. And that was true from the very beginning, because one of the settings that I wrote about was a town that actually got destroyed years ago, and I just decided I was going to raise it back up from the bottom of the lake. Technology, though, it plays such an important part in not just law enforcement, but our lives, that I really do try to write about it a lot. Obviously, so if you were to read, The Poacher's Son now, so much has changed. I mean, the cell phones were not quite as.
How many years ago was that?
That was 15 years ago. So I feel a certain need to kind of keep up, but on the other hand, it's always trying to figure out what's the right amount to get into this. I mean, I'm not writing about cybercrime, fortunately for me. But I will say, I think, a lot of times an author will set a book in the past as a way of like, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to have to deal with social media. I don't know how to write about it. And it's like, so I'll just set this in the 1970s. And it's like, I don't know.
Well, I think the easy answer is Sue.
You can see how I feel about that.
Yeah. Sue made a decision not to age Kinsey, but also not to change her world, to keep her in the same world. What Paul, not Mike, right. What Paul and other authors are doing is they're letting the character not age, but the world moves forward. So you're always in a contemporary setting, but we all as readers agree that, if he were really 57, he couldn't be taking his boots off and jumping into the water. Nevada Barr, if you all remember, wrote a really wonderful series about a national park ranger called Anna Pigeon. And I love those books. And she aged Anna in real time and decided to stop because Anna got to be too old to do the kind of physical stuff. It's true with Harry Bosch. Harry's not the center of Michael Connelly's universe anymore. He's aged out of the LAPD. He's sort of, and so, those are decisions you as a reader have to make. I'm fine with the world moving on and, Mike going slow.
But Mike's only 9 years older.
Right. Yeah. I mean, part of that comes from the fact that I'm always thinking, well, he was just shot in the last book. So he's got to be getting physical therapy for that. It's like I can't just like pretend that didn't happen. So it's almost, again, it's this idea of the saga kind of thing, which is that what has happened to him in the past is affecting him in the present books. And so, yes, even though maybe he's aging, more slowly than I am, he is aging and things are happening to him that are changing him. The way that he sees the world is changing his body, is changing his attitudes. And I've tried to integrate, in Dead Man's Wake, the book that Barbara was talking about, that starts with Mike finding a disembodied arm in a lake. There's a lot of technology in that book. It's like, okay, how do we find the rest of the body? And that was fun, to learn. But again, it's one of those things that keeps changing and keeps changing. In a few years, it will be, I was writing about state-of-the-art technology, and it will be no longer state-of-the-art.
Anybody else?
I'm from Maine originally. I like reading Maine authors, and my brother Roland met Maine author Vaughn Hardacker,
Mhm.
and he wrote Wendigo, and he signed up for him because he's a vet like my brother. So he said to me, I stopped reading, and I like reading about books in Maine woods because it's all the switchbacks, and I know all of them because I used to go hunt out there. And then my brother Dan, who lives in Connecticut, started reading your books, and I haven't even read a single book yours, and I read the bio on this one and you, and I said, oh, this is going to be interesting because I love reading about books, so I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
Book one now.
Oh, good. That's the way I would recommend it. Although one of the things I always tell people is that Mike he's still frustrating, but if you read the early books, he is so frustrating that you don't give up. he gets better.
That's really true. Unfortunately, all of the earlier books are still in print, and we had all of the earlier books, but a couple of people came in and bought all the earlier books, and we couldn't get them back fast enough. But we can order them for you,
Yeah.
or you can pick them up. But not every author with 15 books has all of the backlist, the earlier ones available. So it's lucky that
Thank you very much.
that you can do that. And it's not that the stories aren't complete in each book. The crime, whatever it is, goes its course and is solved. But what changes book to book are the characters. So if you don't read them in that order, then there will be spoilers for characters.
Yeah,
that,
you'll,
you know.
Mike has several different love interests over the course of the series, and that can get confusing to some people who just are reading them out of order, saying, "Wait a minute, I thought his girlfriend was
Right.
X."
I blame the python for Stacy's return. Right. Anybody else?
You mentioned Joe Pickett before, and he has lots of, he's influenced a lot or troubled a lot by politics, by the government, by politicians. Is that in your, I'm new to your books. This is my first one. So do Maine people in that position have a lot of problems with politics and the government as well?
Well, I think everybody these days has problems with politics. No, I mean, I think one of the things about Chuck is, you know, he's writing about the Mountain West, in which, as in Arizona, the federal government owns a lot of land. Maine, and that causes you know, all kinds of different conflicts. People have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, you know, it's federal land, but your family's always been ranching on it, so why can't my cattle be on the federal land? And so he really just tackles those issues just head on, and I really admire the way that he does that. It's less of an issue in Maine because Maine is actually the state that has the most private property ownership of anything, of any place. There's very little in Maine that's open to the public. I mean, that's owned by the public. We have one national park, and it's small.
Yeah.
And we have one, I think just one national monument. And even though there are, I mean, Maine is also about the size of the rest of New England put together. So and it's very few people, relatively, a little bit more than 1 million, spread out over that area, mostly along the coast. But, you know, without having, say, that the conflicts that you might have with out-of-state interests. I mean, you know, it's mostly the conflicts that Mainers tend to have is with the people who own this property. You know, and they will come in and set new rules about, or they're going to decide, hey, we're gonna cut all this woods down, and we want to develop it. You know, the lakes, you know, or whatever it is. So it's sort of less politics in the sort of the traditional sense of, you know, bureaucrats and that sort of thing, and more politics in the sense of power dynamics and who's making decisions and how close are they to the, you know, are they in touch, right? I was talking before about the Border Patrol, you know, and the Border Patrol, obviously they become more, the longer they spend on the Maine border, the more they get it. But when, you know, when they've just come here from Nogales, you know, they do not understand the town of Fort Kent. It's like, does not resemble anything that I've ever seen before.
PK, do you have a question from the virtual audience?
Yeah, I've actually got quite a few, but we're going to start off with one from Robin Stoll, who is one of your pre-readers before you get the books published. And one of their questions is, what do you do to frame a scene? How do you, because you're so good at kind of description and everything, what is it that you look for to describe what's going on?
Well, thank you for that question. I do the best I can with my writing. One of the things about writing suspense, especially, I went when I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I went and got a master's degree in writing, which I largely wasted my time. But one of the things that I did not waste was I took some screenwriting classes, and screenwriting has a lot to teach about writing concisely and effectively and dramatically, obviously. And so, for instance, one of the things about writing a scene is you don't try to have lots of filler. You try to enter into, you know, at the last possible moment before things start to happen. So the scene starts and things begin to happen, and then you write about the things happening and you don't linger. That's the end of the scene. You move on to the next one. I think when you're a new writer and you're sort of in love with words and everything, you tend to fill stuff out, and things get all padded, and it's less economical. And so I try to. That's one of those little pieces of advice that sits in the back of my brain.
The next question that we've got is, how difficult was it for you to get an agent? The person online's curious, I think, because they're also writing an outdoor style mystery.
Yeah, I've heard that these days it's harder to get an agent than it is a publisher, and I don't know if that's true or not. It certainly feels true, and it partly has to do with it's harder to get an agent than it is to get a conventional publisher, I would say. A Macmillan or a Random House or HarperCollins or whatever. And the reason for that is that the editors at these big houses are relying on the agents to sort of do all the weeding, to only bring them books that are publishable, that have reached a certain kind of standard. So my agent definitely made me rewrite the book before she submitted it, the first book. One of the things. So Anne Rittenberg is my agent. She's been my agent for more than 15 years now, and sometimes I have to admit that I'm not the right person to ask about getting published, because I've been with the same agent, I've been with the same publisher for so long that I haven't had to fight these battles that the emerging writer has to fight to get the attention of an agent, to get their book published, etc. It can be hard, yeah, but even harder, I think, to find somebody who really understands what you're trying to do. I mean, I think that the reason I have 15 books is I have a wonderful agent who understands this character, who understands me. I've been working with the same editor, and he understands what we're trying to do, and we're all on the same team with this. It's a very, I feel immense gratitude for the career I've been given.
The other question that we have is in regards to basically being an outdoorsman. Do you do some of the things that you discussed in the book in order to be able to write it well, or do you do a lot of this through research? What do you do to make sure that your writing is authentic?
A lot of the stuff that I've written about, I've done without thinking of it as research. It's just dumb stuff I've done when I've been outdoors. Over the course of my lifetime, it's like I don't want to tell you the number of injuries that I've given to Mike Bowditch that I personally have sustained. There's always sort of two types of research. There is stuff where it may be very specific to the setting that I'm writing about, where I really need to go back there. It might have been that, say, I went to the border, to this part of the border, 15 years ago. I need to go back and see what it looks like now, just to get a sense of whatever it is. But it's the thing that helps me out a lot is that I'm writing about things that I'm genuinely interested in, and things that I genuinely do, so that the research isn't me sitting down in front of a book. It's me, getting out there and making sure that I get in the helicopter with, the person I want to write about, and et cetera. I think it helps. It helps with the sort of verisimilitude. I'm really, one of the things that's always motivated me was that I can always tell if I'm reading a novel and somebody's writing about the outdoors if they don't know anything about the outdoors, because it just gets under my skin, and that's one of the motivating things for me, is that I just it's like you're right. We have a lot of coastal books, right? Big best-selling books set in summer homes on the coast of Maine. They sell 1 million copies. And historical cottages owned by multi-generations of families. And every 4th of July, there's this and that and everything. And I defy you to find a single mosquito in one of those books. Because I guarantee you, on the 4th of July, as you're sitting outside waiting for the fireworks to go off, the first thing on your mind is going to be that damn mosquito. Where is it? So it's like that kind of thing. That kind of like, it just bugs me. Literally.
And of course, the final question I have online is Hollywood. Are they ringing your doorstep? Are they trying to beat down, take a book and turn it into a movie? Or
I always say that whenever one of my books gets reviewed in the New York Times or People or the Wall Street Journal, a publisher will call. And we've come close a number of times over the years, but I've come to feel that, and I'm going to say this frankly, it has a lot to do with Lee Child, his experience, that I like the Tom Cruise Reacher movies. I think they're fun for what they are, but they're not Jack Reacher. And I would rather have no series than a bad series. And I'm fortunate that I can say no to people who...
So when you said a publisher calls, you didn't mean
a producer.
publisher.
I mean a producer, sorry, yeah.
That's okay.
A producer will call and say, oh, what are the rights? Are you interested in optioning this? Etc. So
They actually have people who cruise through like Publishers Weekly looking for starred reviews and so forth. Anything that looks like it might have some potential for, filming.
and then they put it on the shelf and they don't do anything with it, which is another concern.
That's true. Yes.
Since you've got the setting for this book a little further north in Maine, do we have a little interaction with the Quebecois this time?
We do. Mike has to. There's at least one scene where Mike's mother is French, Franco-American, and Mike retains a small fraction of the French that she used to speak with her parents, and he has to. He runs into a couple of characters who don't speak English particularly well, and so I have to do sort of Franglish or whatever you call it. In it, and that was actually one of the fun things. I mean, there's Mounties in this book, and
It's true, but Quebecois French is not French, Parisian French,
Right.
so it is quite different. And you had a book earlier, I'm hopeless on titles, but it was another border book, but there was a town involved. This is a border book in the wilderness, so they're really quite different in that, the setting of it, the fact that one of them involved a town and a bridge and, that kind of thing, as opposed to being out here in the mountains where there wasn't any border crossing or any defined line or whatever. So I thought it was interesting, to read them. I mean, having read both of them, I thought that it was really nifty the way you pointed out that how different it is depending on where on the border you are.
Well, the New Brunswick border, for instance, is largely English-speaking. If you go across, the Quebec border is French-speaking, and you actually don't have to go very far before, there was for decades, there was a Quebec independence movement. And you don't have to go very far before you'll start running into somebody who really struggles to speak English.
Came quite close. I'm trying to remember. There was a Bouchercon, the Mystery Convention in Toronto. Must have been right around 2000 to right in that very early time. And that was sort of when that separation thing was really peaking about the Quebecois wanting to separate from Canada. And then they didn't. I was interested in visiting Newfoundland to discover that Newfoundland at one point took a vote before it joined Canada to see whether it wanted to join the U.S. or Canada, despite the fact that it was some distance away, and ultimately went with Canada. But it never occurred to me that they might have said voluntarily. I don't know that we would have accepted them even. Well, I mean, because that's a real problem. I mean, we're not even doing a good job with Puerto Rico, so why
And they
would
don't
we
have
wanna
cod anymore either,
Newfoundland?
so.
Yeah, right.
They don't have the Newfie bullet anymore.
That's right. Yes, sir.
I think there was my wife and I lived in Maine 40 years, but I think Maine wanted to join Canada.
Yeah, Maine really.
They called it the Maritimes.
Yeah, we're surrounded.
Jerry Boyle wrote a book which went back in history. When Benedict Arnold went up through Maine, and part of the reason was to persuade Canada to join the U.S. And it looked for a while like that might be successful, but ultimately was not. So, who knows as we carry on whether there will be any kind of a merge or not. Yes.
How do you bang out a book every year? You must be so disciplined.
I guess I'm disciplined. I mean, I'm not C.J. Box who can bang out 2 books a year. The way that I always describe it is I think learning to write a novel is like learning to do anything. The more that you do it, the more that you understand what needs to happen. And the problem is that every book is different, even if it's part of a series. And so the people in my life will often, they'll see me starting to stress out, and they're like, "Why are you stressing out? You do this every year. You can do this." And I'm like, you can write a book. And I'm like, yes, but I've never written this book before.
It's not a formula.
It's not a formula for me, at least. And so, I just try to be very, very disciplined about it. And
It's a job.
it's my job. Yeah, it's my job
Where's your
too.
office now?
What's that?
Where's your office now?
My office is in the town of Rockland, which advertises its talk about slogans. It advertises itself as the lobster capital of the world, although it no longer is. It's the lobster capital has drifted a little further east at this stage, but
Yeah, the first time I went to Maine was '92, and so when did Rockland stop stinking?
when did Rockland stop? I think this is the first
Here's a
time
question we've
I've
never
never
had
had that
before.
question before. Rockland
Before that.
Rockland was famous as not only the lobster capital, but it had a lot of sardine packing factories, and so there was a smell about it that.
As the bay has changed,
Well,
the
and
fishing
people,
is changing.
quite honestly,
Yeah.
Americans don't eat sardines anymore, really. So those packing plants have gone elsewhere. So to the benefit of Rockland homeowners who've seen their property values go up as the air is less. There is a funny our last factory in Rockland is a seaweed factory. It makes what is that stuff called? Carrageenan. It's processed from seaweed, and it's used in all kinds of different. It's used in ice cream. So it's actually, if you get a shake from McDonald's, you're probably eating seaweed from Maine. I think it's used to thicken it. And that does have a very distinctive odor. Right? It's not horrible, but it's very salty and a little fishy, and but it's all local color.
Is your next book underway?
Is my next book underway? Yes, it is. My next book always has to be underway. That's the short answer.
Any hints about it, or
Hints. Even though this organization has been long disbanded, the KGB plays a role in it.
Ooh, a May Spine novel. Oh.
Yes,
Love
and
it.
my friend, I will openly
Tess
say, my
Gerritsen
friend
has influenced
my
you.
friend Tess Gerritsen has influenced me.
If you want a really great Maine book, you should read Tess Gerritsen's new book called The Spy Coast. I mean, it is really brilliant. And apparently true that a considerable number of people who worked in the CIA and other places have retired to Maine.
Yes,
Wow.
so Tess and I live in the same town, and it is sort of this open secret that a bunch of the people that you run into at Rotary and et cetera are former, spies. And sometimes you will have known them for years and years and years, and they'll start telling you something just like, oh yeah, I spent 10 years in Panama. And you're like, why the hell did you spend 10 years well, of course he spent 10 years in Panama because he was probably propping up Noriega or something. I don't. Who knows, right? And then then you hear, oh yeah, he's vacationing in Kyrgyzstan now. It's like, who vacations in Kyrgyzstan? Well, an ex-CIA agent, maybe. I don't know. So yes, Tess was onto something with that book, and I'm not using her.
No, I thought it was
Her
a gorgeous
conceit,
book,
but,
yeah, and she's writing a sequel to it. But they're, if you have a place that has a lot of wilderness and a thin population, it's an ideal place, for people to go and hide, right?
Yep.
So, anyway, thank you all very much for
Yeah,
your
thank you,
attention this
everybody.
afternoon. I
Appreciate it.
feel like we've all reached butt fatigue because these chairs are not, well, an hour to an hour and 10 minutes, I see
Yeah.
people starting to swerve, it's just kind of a deal. So thank you very much. We do have, well, first of all, let's thank Paul for coming. And second, although I may not be able to get his attention, John, do we have a count? Thank you. John is so good. I can always hear him. Sometimes there's a little whisper from up front. I like to give away a book, an advanced reading copy that I get, which